Hello everyone, this is me, Ewaenruwa Nomaren, and this is my channel, It Pays to Fear God. This is where we learn about God, His beloved Son Jesus Christ, and their kingdom purpose, the three most important subjects that we can ever learn about, talk about, or discuss in the entire Holy Bible, according to John chapter 17, verse 3. The subject that we are going to be learning about today is captioned Overcoming Racism. However, before we get into that, I once again have a tune that some of us might enjoy. Once again, the subject that we're going to be learning about today is captioned Overcoming Racism, and I'll be inviting my brother to come tell us a little more about that.
Racism is a seemingly complex problem that has existed for hundreds of years and will certainly last at least decades more. However, as Christians, we want to know how God feels about this practice. And if we analyze racism through the eyes of the Bible, we can understand that racism isn't as hard to tackle as we think. Of course, it's important for us to realize that the world wasn't always like this. After all, in Genesis chapter 2, verses 16 to 23, God created Adam and Eve, and it didn't seem like there would be any conflict between any future members of their species. However, in Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 to 6, Adam and Eve sinned against God in the Garden of Eden, allowing humans to choose what was good to them and what was evil to them. And that allowed evil to spread, things like conflict and dislike of others. And in Genesis chapters 10 to 11, after the flood, Noah and his family created a new line of humans that would eventually spread and form new races and cultures. These are the ingredients of racism. This would eventually lead to the situation in Exodus chapter 2, verses 12 to 13, where Moses killed an Egyptian because that Egyptian was being racist to one of the Hebrews. Of course, has the Bible talked about racism itself? The answer is yes, because in the New Testament, Jews were being racist against Samaritans. You see, when the Assyrians took the 10 Israelite tribes into exile, they sent some of their own people to populate the now sparsely inhabited lands. And those people mingled with the Israelites who were still there. And then this new Israelite nation started adopting the Assyrian gods and customs and religious traditions. And Judah was just watching, and they said, wow, these guys don't know what kind of religion they're really worshiping. And so they felt superior to the Israelites because they had at least kept some sense of proper religion. The Jews could not associate with the Samaritans because of these differences. And of course, it basically became racism. For example, in John chapter 4, verse 9, a Samaritan woman told Jesus that Jews didn't accept the water of Samaritans, anything from them. But the early apostles, the early church leaders didn't care about any of this racism. For example, in Luke chapter 10, verses 25 to 37, Jesus told a parable of the Good Samaritan, where an Israelite traveler had been beaten up by thieves, and a Levite passed him, and a priest passed him without helping him. But it was a Samaritan who was coming by, who would pick him up and send him to an inn and give him money for treatment. It was the Samaritan who was the true neighbor of the Jew, even though those two Jews who passed by him were closer to him by blood and physically. Just like with the Samaritan, blacks, people of color, and immigrants can provide support to the white majority nations that they might find themselves in. Even St. Peter, as righteous as he was, had a thing or two to learn about racism. Because in Acts chapter 10, verses 10 to 16, he got a vision where he was seeing all kinds of unclean plants and animals that Jews normally weren't supposed to eat because of the guidelines that God had given Israel in the desert. But the angel in the vision was telling him that he could eat those things. And eventually, St. Peter realized that the dream wasn't really about unclean plants and animals. It was about the way Jews were treating the Gentiles, foreigners like Greeks and Romans who were converting to the faith. St. Peter realized that the truth was now for everyone. It wasn't just for Jews. And in verses 34 and 35 of Acts chapter 10, he told Cornelius and his family this: "Of a truth I perceive that God is no respecter of persons, but in every nation he that feareth him and worketh righteousness is accepted with him." So now I'm going to go into several big fuels of racism and explain how we can deal with them. For example, the first one I'm going to talk about is hatred. Hatred is a big driver of racism because that's essentially what racism is: hating somebody because of their race. And the Bible gives us examples of people who hated others in the Bible so we can understand how we can apply it to today's world. For example, in Genesis chapter 4, verses 3 to 8, Cain hated Abel because his offering was accepted by God, but not his own. Cain killed Abel as a result of his hatred for him, and he got banished from where Adam, Eve, and their other children were living. And in 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 7 to 9, King Saul and David were coming back from a war against the Philistines, and some women were singing, "Saul has killed his thousands, and David has killed his 10,000s. So Saul thought that this was unfair, that he should be the one praised more, regardless of the fact that David had killed Goliath. And so he hated David, and he wanted to kill David. And that was what caused all the years of suffering that David had to go through as he dodged Saul's army. Now, this may seem obvious, but we can battle hatred like this by using the power of love. The Bible already tells us that we're supposed to love God and love our neighbor, according to Galatians chapter 5, verse 14, which reads, "For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." But we should also learn from Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 19, which reads, "Love ye therefore the stranger, for ye were strangers in the land of Egypt." Stranger in this case means foreigner, like in French. And we should treat foreigners with respect, especially here in North America, because aside from the Native Americans, we were all immigrants to this continent at some point. So when we see others coming to our countries, we should embrace them. We should rejoice that they've succeeded in coming, and we should celebrate when they succeed in living here. The next driver of racism that I want to talk about is pride. And pride is a big driver of racism because that is what brings superiority into the picture. A white person is going to feel superior to a person of color because he's proud of his race and his race's accomplishments, and he thinks that his race is better than another. And just like with hatred, the Bible gives us examples of people who are proud. For instance, Haman was definitely a very proud person. But before we go into his story, we have to look at what he had to be proud of to begin with. You see, the Babylonians had conquered Judah and sent them into exile. They were taken into Babylon, all their possessions, everything. And Haman was a big official in Babylon. So he was partly in charge of all these new captives and also his own people. And so when he saw Mordecai, just an average, ordinary Jew, not bowing to him, he felt offended. He wondered, why is this peasant, this person with no royal ties or any importance whatsoever, refusing to bow to me? Does he think that he's more superior to me? And so Haman wanted him dead. And not just him, but his whole race. And so we can see that we do not want to be proud. We'd rather be humble people, according to Proverbs chapter 16, verse 19, and Matthew chapter 23, verse 12. And whosoever shall exalt himself shall be abased, and he that shall humble himself shall be exalted. But we can't just say that we're humble in order to become humble. No, we have to figure out how to make ourselves humble somehow by taking action. And we can learn from the example of Jesus in John chapter 13, verse 5. Jesus washed his disciples' feet. Remember, these were people who he was teaching. He had more spiritual knowledge, but yet he washed their feet to show them what humility was like. And taking this back to racism, white people can do some kinds of things like that just to have someone else be superior for a change. Doing stuff like this, whether we're white or black, helps us become more humble, and it will allow us to gain the blessings of being humble. According to James chapter 4, verse 10, which reads, "Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he shall lift you up." And finally, let's go into power. A really big thing in the context of racism, because if a white person hates a black person or feels superior to a black person, it doesn't matter if he himself does not have any power to exhibit those feelings or to make those feelings heard. It was power that allowed various European nations to take blacks from Africa and enslave them across the Atlantic. It was power that allowed those same nations to colonize half the world. And it's still power that allows governments, white, Arab, Chinese, to make laws that don't help foreigners. So power is clearly a big factor in racism. And again, the Bible has an example to show what power can do. In Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 to 11, Pharaoh decided to start enslaving the Israelites, who were in that land to escape the famine that had ravaged everywhere else, because he wanted to keep them from gaining more political power, and he wanted to exploit their potential. So, how do we fix this kind of thing? Well, there isn't really an easy opposite to help us, because the opposite of power is not having power. And we can't go trying to use physical power, like violently protesting, in order to try to get our voices heard. Because as Romans chapter 13 verse 1 says, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers. For there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God." We have to respect the authorities that are over us, no matter how racist their laws may be. However, as most of us live in democracies, we can use our voting power to make changes. And as Christians, we can pray to God that we don't get involved in racial violence and racial hatred, because God can answer our prayers. According to Matthew chapter 7, verses 7 to 8, which read, "Ask and it shall be given you. Seek and ye shall find. Knock and it shall be opened unto you. For every one that asketh receiveth, and he that seeketh findeth, and to him that knocketh it shall be opened. And Matthew chapter 21, verse 22, which reads, And all things whatsoever ye shall ask in prayer, believing ye shall receive. Now, we can all see that it is important that we get racism to end, but we have to understand that we aren't doing this alone. We serve a powerful God who is capable of bringing peace to the entire world, according to Psalms chapter 46, verse 9, and chapter 29, verse 11. And he is going to be bringing us peace in the new world that he's going to be creating, according to Revelation chapter 21, verse 1, which reads, And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. This new world that God is creating for those who worship him in truth will have no death, and it will have no sin, according to Revelation chapter 20, verses 10 to 15. And this world will not feature any suffering, any pain, and certainly it will not feature any racism, according to Revelation chapter 21, verse 4. In conclusion, overcoming racism is a challenge that all of us need to face. But knowing God makes it easier for us to face it. All races can use the Word of God to create a more just and equitable society. And that is the end of my talk on the subject, overcoming racism. Thank you for listening.
And there, my viewers, it's some information on overcoming racism. In these last days, racism is raging, and we have to know how to control it. God sees a black person the same as a white person, an Indian person, the same way as a Latino person. The only thing that he really discriminates or differentiates is righteousness from iniquity. Therefore, in order to stay on God's side, instead of thinking of the difference between white people and black people, we should think of the difference between righteousness and iniquity, because that is the difference between people who will be saved and people who will be damned, people who believe in God and people who don't. Mark chapter 16, verse 16. There are some people who are of color who can bring excellent ideas into society that will improve the economy. They will improve the social system. They will improve all kinds of systems if we just give them that chance. Because, of course, smart people does not depend on their race, it depends on their brains, and that comes from all races. Therefore, we have to be open to people coming to our societies, because everything in it will grow if we just take that advice. To conclude this episode, I once again have a tune that some of us might enjoy. Hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you learned something. Most importantly, please try to subscribe and share this video, because racism is causing some long-lasting problems in this world, and all we need to do is look at the Bible's view on racism, and instead of looking at the difference between a white man and a black man, let's look at the difference between righteousness and iniquity and stick with righteousness. Thank you for listening.